All these components right here are going to make up an AMD Ryzen 5 3400G X570 ITX Build, and it's going to be awesome. So if you want to check that out, stick around because it's TechWizTime. Hey guys, Jonathan here with TechWizTime, where I create technology tutorial and review videos. In this video, I'm going to be looking at doing an AMD Ryzen 5 3400G build using the X570 motherboard. So before I start with the actual build itself and go through the time lapse, what I'll do is I'll go through each of the components so you know what they are, and then we can go from there. This is the 3400G, and it's an all-in-one CPU with GPU or an APU, and that's going to power this ITX build. So the next thing that's going into this is the motherboard, and that is the Gigabyte X570i Aorus Pro Wi-Fi ITX board. Now, this little guy here, he's not cheap. The X570 range is definitely not cheap, and I think that's got to do primarily with the chips that they use and so forth. It's definitely not one for a budget builder. So yeah, if you're not into spending a little bit, then this probably isn't for you. But in saying that, this ITX board looks amazing with all its features. Not as many USB ports as I'd like, but then again, this is an ITX build, so yeah, you get what you can take with ITX. Next up is the power supply. Now this is the Corsair V7 550. At the moment, I think the VS 650 is the one that you can get on Amazon. So the case, which I will look at next, is the NZXT H200. Now this is the white one. It is a really, really nice looking case. It's got the tempered glass side panel there and also the white trim inside. It's going to look amazing with this all in there. I personally can't wait to see what it looks like once it's fully built. But you guys would have already seen that right at the very start, so good on you. So the next thing I'm going to be using in this build is the Intel 660p 1TB M2 drive, and that's just going to give me enough space to be able to install games, Windows, and not have to worry too much. I didn't want to go for the standard 2.5-inch drive, purely because the price was right on this one. On Amazon, I think I picked it up for just around $90, which, to be honest, is a fantastic price right now for any SSD or M2 drive. And lastly, we've got the RAM. Now, I've opted to go for not the highest rated speed RAM, but this is 2 sticks of 8GB rated at 3200 megahertz. It's from Corsair, and to be honest, I've done some research before this, and this particular combination of RAM and the speed, I think I'm going to be able to get some really good results out of this APU. So with that all said, let's get all these parts off the desk and let's get cranking into building this ITX Ryzen 3400G build. All right, let's go. Okay, so there we have it, the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G ITX build. Now first things first, what I'll do is I'll go over the costing of all the components in the case itself. So the case itself, the H200 from NZXT, you can get that on special at the moment on Amazon for about $85. So not a bad price for a really nice looking ITX case. It's got really good cable management in the back, the tempered glass panel there, and you've got a variety of different trims that you can get. You can get an all black one if you want. I went with the white one because I'm just a fan of white. But you've got other colors there, blue and red, so yeah, check that out. The next step is the motherboard itself. Now, the Gigabyte X570i Aorus Wi-Fi, Pro Wi-Fi, sorry. These names, they're so long. Okay, it's a little bit of a hard board to source. Like I looked on a variety of websites and not a lot of people are stocking them at this stage. If you are looking for one, I provided a couple links down in the description, but again, this one isn't cheap. It's, yeah, I think the cheapest I found it was about $220, although you're probably looking at around $295 on eBay and so forth. And that's in US dollars, I might add. So yeah, not the cheapest boards, but we already knew that the X570 boards were going to be really expensive, so no real shocker there. Next up, we've got the RAM, and we're looking at the Corsair Vengeance low profile RAM, 16 gigabytes, so two 8GB sticks running in dual channel, and they are running at 3200 megahertz. And I have actually confirmed that it is running on that board at 3200 megahertz, so that's great. Personally, I'm not too worried about CAS latency speeds. This is a CAS latency or CL of 16. You can get it down at 14 if you wanted in other brands, but to be honest, going down to CAS latency 14 in this particular RAM configuration, I did the math, and to be honest, like you get 1 to 2% increase in frames, and you're only going to see the price that you're going to pay is going to be almost double for that extra 1 to 2%. So not worth it in my opinion. Now the CPU, the AMD 3400G, or the AMD Ryzen 5 3400G I should say, it comes in at $150. Where you can find it. Now, I did see it on Micro Center for about $149, but you do have to go in store to get that. So if you're in the US, then that's where you can get that from. Otherwise, online, you can find it at a whole range of prices, ranging from $190 to $250 shipped. So yeah, it really depends on how much you really want this, but I'll try and include links down in the description for the cheapest ones that I can find. Next up, we've got the power supply. Now, I did say I was going to use the VS550 in this particular build. However, it didn't quite work out. I had a few issues with it and I didn't want to use it. Now, it wasn't an issue with the actual power supply itself. The power supply was good. It was an issue with something that I did to it. So yeah, I had to use the thermal take that I had spare lying around, I should say, and that was perfectly adequate. To be honest, with the low TDP that the 3400G has, and it's not running a graphics card or anything like that, you don't really need anything over a 300 watt for a little ITX system like this. It doesn't need the power. Unless you're running a bunch of hard drives, DVD drive, an internal graphics card, then yeah, maybe go up a little bit more, but otherwise, yeah, a low wattage power supply would be perfectly fine in this ITX build. And lastly, we've got the storage, and that was using the Intel 660p 1 terabyte. Now, I've seen this go as low as $89 US for a 1 terabyte stick, and that's just amazing for an M2 drive. Yeah, the speeds aren't up there with, say, a Samsung, but then again, you're paying a price premium for a Samsung product, whereas the Intel one, you're getting it for a lot cheaper, and it does a pretty good job. Speeds are better than a normal 2.5-inch SSD, so yeah, that's why I had no issue with using the Intel 660p. So with it all put together and all the pricing and all that sort of thing out of the way, it works out at around a $700 build. And that's not too bad. It could be cheaper if you cut corners, like you got a smaller power supply. If you weren't too interested in 16 gig of RAM, you could bump that down to 8 gig of RAM. To be honest, if you're gaming on this, I would definitely recommend 16 gigabytes. I will be bringing out a video shortly showing the differences between 8 gigabytes and 16 gigabytes, just so you can see that. When I do release it, I'll try and include it in the cards above or in the description below. And to be completely honest, you could actually go with a B450 motherboard in the ITX size. That would be perfectly fine for the 3400G, especially if you're not looking at you know, upgrading anytime soon to say a 3900X or anything like that. The B450 will be fine at this stage. So with that said, let's talk about benchmarks, and in particular, I didn't want to run the usual 3D Mark and so forth, because there are going to be plenty of videos out there for people that are running 3D Mark, Geekbench, you know, Time Spy in 3D Mark, obviously, and all those sort of benchmarks. And to be honest, yeah, that it's going to perform very, very similarly to those videos, so I'm not too concerned. What I was more concerned about is how it actually gamed, and I just picked 2 games purely because of time, and the 2 games that I chose were Shadow of the Tomb Raider and Grand Theft Auto 5, since it's a newer title and then an older title that a lot of people want to play. So with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, the scores look like this. On 1080p at setting high, we had 20 frames per second. On medium, we had 21 frames per second, and on low, we had 27 frames per second. So not quite meeting the minimum 30 to 60 FPS, depending on which camp you're in. If you did a little bit of overclocking and maybe tweaking and so forth, you could probably bump it up those extra 3 or 4 frames per second, and it should be fine. So can you achieve 1080p gaming in Shadow of the Tomb Raider? Yeah, probably at 1080p, but let's have a look at the 720p scores first. So at 720p at the setting of high, we're looking at 34 frames per second. On the setting of medium, we're looking at 35 frames per second. And on the setting of low, we're looking at 43 frames per second. So if you're willing to sacrifice the resolution and go down to 720p, then Shadow of the Tomb Raider is perfectly playable, especially if you're not a 60 FPS sort of guy. If you're happy with 30 frames per second and it drops every now and then 720p is going to be perfectly fine for you. And let's be honest, this is an APU, and compared to its Intel counterparts, it's got a lot more gaming power than they ever will. So yeah, I'm more than happy with those scores, and you should be too. So the next game we'll check out is GTA 5, and we'll do the 1080p and the 720p benchmarks, all on normal and with it turned off on the VSync, because yeah, VSync's just going to limit it. So at 1080p, we're achieving 67 frames per second, which is fantastic. This game is perfectly playable at 60 FPS at 1080p. So yeah, this is awesome. You can probably turn on a few other settings there, but to be honest, if you want to have a really smooth experience, I'd leave it at the 1080p at normal. I used the same settings on the 720p test, and we got 107 frames per second. Now that is perfectly playable. If you're happy to drop it down to 720p, then you're going to be getting amazing frame rates in GTA 5. So huge win there for gamers. All right, so with the benchmarks out of the way, I just want to talk a little bit about the build and a couple of issues that I had, just so that way, yeah, you're aware of them if you're looking at building something similar. So one of the issues that I faced was when I was swapping in and out different M2 drives, just testing it and so forth. One of the things that happened, and I've spoken to someone else and they've had the same sort of issues, is that the BIOS will basically completely lock up. I don't think this is an X570 problem. I think it's just a motherboard problem when using M2 drives in general. So yeah, if you are using, or testing out different M2 drives, then you may experience a similar problem. But for most of us out there that are just, set it and forget it, you're probably not going to see that issue. And on that point, when it comes to resetting the BIOS, this motherboard has Q-Flash, which means that you can throw the BIOS onto a USB stick and then press a button on the back here, which I'll show you. And that will mean that basically you don't need to turn the computer on. I mean, you don't need to have a CPU in there or RAM or a video card. You can purely just put the USB stick into the right port, hit the Q-Flash button, and away it'll go. But back to the main reason that I was talking about the BIOS was that on the motherboard itself, you've got the 2 pins where you can clear the CMOS, and you can do that with a screwdriver. No issues there whatsoever. But if you're looking at the battery, it's actually covered by the I/O shroud. So the built-in I/O shroud covers the battery on the motherboard, which I thought was really, really strange. Yeah, fair enough, you're not going to need to change out the battery that often, but if you just want to flick the battery out and yeah, do a quick reset that way, it takes a little bit to actually get to it. So yeah, just a little bit of a con there. The other issue that I've got with the motherboard itself is that I know it's ITX, it doesn't have enough fan headers on the motherboard. Now, granted, it's got the M2 shroud, with the fan built in. That takes up one of the onboard fan spots. You've got your CPU fan, but then outside of that, you've only got one other one that you can use. So unless you want to go to your 4-pin power from your power supply and not power it from the motherboard, then you can do that. But otherwise, yeah, you're limited by the fact that there's only one spot on there. So I just thought, oh, yeah, a lot of ITX cases, you know, you want to keep them nice and cool. You might have 2 or 3 fans in there. It would have been nice to see, yeah, a couple of more headers on there. But then again, it is ITX, so we get what we get with it. Now, as it's an ITX case, there isn't a lot of room to move. And one of the issues that I faced with the actual case itself was in the corner where the motherboard 8-pin power is. Yeah, that was quite difficult to get to. And I actually had to remove the back and the top fan just to get to it. With foresight, I should have actually routed the cable beforehand, installed it before I installed the motherboard. But because I didn't do that, it actually took a lot longer to plug in the 8-pin there. So yeah, just a forethought. If you are installing a motherboard into this case, try and install that 8-pin power before you install the motherboard onto the case. Or into the case, I should say. And one more thing, if you are looking at installing an internal GPU, then it will fit up to a 325mm length. So most cards will be fine in there. If you are looking at installing a water cooler, like the NZXT X52 Kraken or whatever, then you're going to be limited by about 270mm for the GPU. So yeah, just take that into account when you're planning out your build and you should be fine. So as an ITX build with the latest Ryzen 5 3400G or the 3000 series, even though this is Zen Plus, yeah, I know it's not the 3000 True series, but it is a really, really good install. Would I recommend it if you're looking at going from a 2400G to a 3400G? No, not necessarily. I don't think the frame rates are quite there to justify upgrading to a new CPU. You'd be better off spending your money on an internal GPU instead. So yeah, if you wanted to look at upgrading from a 2400G, I would highly suggest spending that money on a graphics card instead. So that was my ITX Ryzen 5 3400G build for 2019, and I really hope you enjoyed it. If you did and you want to see more builds in the future, then make sure you subscribe to this channel, and also, if you can, give it a like. You don't have to like it, you can dislike it if you like. Like, dislike, you get it. If you're feeling generous, you can share this on social media platforms like Facebook or Reddit or even Twitter. I'm starting to get a lot more social on Twitter and on the community tab of YouTube. So if you want to check out either of those, then yeah, by all means do. Let me know down in the comments what sort of frame rates you're achieving with your setups. Also leave me your actual configuration down there as well, so I know, and others will in the comments as well. So with that said, thanks for watching, and imagine, learn, create.